October 13th, 1972, what began as a routine charter flight carrying a Uruguayan rugby team to Chile became one of the most harrowing survival stories in human history. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 disappeared into the towering peaks of the Andes Mountains, carrying 45 souls into a frozen hell at 14,000 feet above sea level. What followed was 72 days of unimaginable suffering, impossible choices, and the kind of human endurance that defies belief. The survivors faced temperatures that could kill in minutes, starvation that drove them to break humanity's ultimate taboo, and despair so complete that death seemed like mercy. Yet 16 people emerged from that icy tomb, forever changed by decisions that no human being should ever have to make. This is their story, a tale of friendship, faith, and the terrible price of survival when civilization strips away and only the will to live remains. The Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo was young, ambitious, and full of life on that crisp October morning in 1972. These weren't professional athletes, but university students and recent graduates who played rugby for the love of the game and the brotherhood it provided. They had chartered Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a Fairchild FH-227, to take them to Santiago, Chile, where they would play a match against a local team. The 45 people aboard the aircraft included 19 members of the rugby team, along with their friends, family members, and supporters. Among them were Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student whose quick thinking would later save lives; Fernando "Nando" Parrado, whose mother and sister were also on the flight; Antonio "Tintin" Vicentin, the team's wing; and Gustavo Zerbino, whose leadership would prove crucial in the dark days ahead. The flight should have been routine, a short hop across the Andes that thousands of planes made safely every year. But as they approached the mountains, weather conditions began to deteriorate rapidly. Dense clouds obscured the peaks, and turbulence shook the aircraft violently. The pilots, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas and Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguarara, were experienced aviators, but they were flying into conditions that would challenge even the most skilled crew. As the plane climbed toward the cruising altitude needed to clear the Andes, the passengers were in high spirits despite the rough weather. They sang rugby songs, joked with each other, and some even played cards in the aisle. Nando Parrado was sitting with his mother and sister, looking forward to showing them Santiago. Roberto Canessa was reading a medical textbook, always the dedicated student. None of them had any idea that they were flying toward a catastrophe that would test the very limits of human survival. The Fairchild FH-227 was not ideally suited for high-altitude flying over the Andes. At 14,000 feet, the air was thin, and the twin-engine aircraft was struggling to maintain altitude in the turbulent conditions. The pilots were navigating by dead reckoning, using their instruments and experience to guide them through the mountain passes. But the thick clouds made visual navigation impossible. At approximately 3:21 p.m., disaster struck with sudden, devastating violence. The aircraft's right wing clipped a mountain peak, sending the plane into an uncontrolled descent. The impact tore off the entire tail section, sucking several passengers out into the thin mountain air. The fuselage, now without its tail, tumbled down the mountainside like a broken toy, bouncing off rocks and snow-covered slopes. Inside the cabin, the passengers were thrown around like rag dolls. Seats broke free from their mountings, luggage flew through the air, and the screams of the terrified passengers mixed with the horrible sound of tearing metal. Nando Parrado was struck in the head by flying debris and knocked unconscious. His mother suffered fatal injuries, and his sister was critically hurt. The fuselage finally came to rest in a small valley high in the Andes, surrounded by towering peaks that reached over 20,000 feet. The silence that followed the crash was broken only by the moans of the injured and the bitter wind that swept across the mountainside. Of the 45 people who had boarded the flight in Montevideo, 12 were already dead, and several others were dying from their injuries. Roberto Canessa, despite being injured himself, immediately began trying to help the wounded. His medical training, though incomplete, made him the closest thing to a doctor the survivors had. He worked frantically to stop bleeding, treat broken bones, and comfort those who were beyond help. The aircraft's emergency medical kit was woefully inadequate for the scope of injuries they were dealing with. The survivors found themselves in an environment that was actively trying to kill them. At 14,000 feet, the air contained only 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and the intense ultraviolet radiation at that altitude caused severe sunburn and snowblind. The Andes in October were still gripped by winter, with no vegetation and no animal life visible anywhere. The fuselage provided some shelter from the wind, but it was damaged and offered little protection from the cold. The survivors huddled together, using seat cushions and whatever clothing they could find to try to stay warm. As night fell on October 13th, bringing temperatures that would drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius, the full horror of their situation began to sink in. They were lost in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth, with no way to communicate with the outside world, no food beyond a few chocolate bars and bottles of wine, and no survival equipment. Worse yet, they had no idea if anyone even knew where they were or if rescue teams were looking for them. But these young men possessed something that would prove more valuable than any survival gear: an unbreakable bond of friendship and a determination to live that would carry them through the darkest moments ahead. The first night after the crash was a preview of the hell the survivors would endure for the next 72 days. Crowded into the broken fuselage, 28 people tried to find space to lie down in an area designed for much fewer passengers. The temperature plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the thin mountain air made every breath a struggle. Roberto Canessa and the other survivors with medical knowledge worked through the night, trying to save the most critically injured. They had virtually no medical supplies, just a small first aid kit that was pathetically inadequate for treating the severe injuries many had sustained. Canessa had to improvise everything, using strips of fabric for bandages and trying to set broken bones without proper equipment. By morning, 3 more people had died from their injuries, bringing the death toll to 15. Among the dead was Nando Parrado's mother, a loss that would devastate him when he finally regained consciousness 3 days later. His sister Susana was still alive, but critically injured, clinging to life despite massive internal injuries. The survivors' first priority was to make the fuselage more habitable and to organize themselves for what they hoped would be a short wait for rescue. They used luggage and debris to block holes in the aircraft's walls, trying to create some protection from the howling wind. They established a system for rationing their meager food supplies: a few chocolates, some nuts, and several bottles of wine that had been intended as gifts. Gustavo Zerbino emerged as one of the natural leaders, helping to organize work details and maintain morale. Despite being only 19 years old, he showed remarkable maturity in managing the group's resources and keeping everyone focused on survival tasks. Other natural leaders included Marcelo Perez, the team captain, and Roy Harley, who took charge of the radio they had managed to salvage from the cockpit. The radio became their lifeline to hope. Roy Harley, who had some technical knowledge, worked tirelessly to get it functioning properly despite the damage it had sustained in the crash. When they finally managed to pick up radio transmissions, they were devastated to learn that the search for their flight had been called off after only 8 days. The authorities had concluded that the plane had probably crashed in the ocean and that there were no survivors. This news was crushing to the survivors' morale. They had been conserving their tiny food supplies in the expectation that rescue would come within days. Now they realized they might be stranded for weeks or even months. The psychological impact was devastating. Several of the survivors broke down completely, while others retreated into silence and despair. Food became an obsession that dominated every waking moment. Their initial supplies were exhausted within the first week, leaving them with nothing but melted snow for sustenance. They tried eating leather from the aircraft seats, toothpaste, and anything else that might provide some nutrition. But these desperate measures provided virtually no calories. The human body can survive for weeks without food, but at high altitude, in extreme cold, and while dealing with injuries, the survivors were burning calories at an alarming rate. They could feel themselves growing weaker each day, their bodies beginning to consume their own muscle tissue to stay alive. Several of the survivors developed severe edema, and their thinking became clouded by hunger and oxygen deprivation. The cold was another constant enemy. Even during the day, temperatures rarely rose above freezing. And at night, they plummeted to levels that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. The survivors had to sleep pressed together for warmth, sharing the few blankets and coats they had managed to salvage. Frostbite was a constant threat, and several survivors lost fingers and toes to the cold. Water was less of a problem than food, as they could melt snow. But even this simple task required careful management of their limited fuel supplies. They had to be constantly alert for signs of dehydration, which could be fatal at high altitude. The intense ultraviolet radiation at their elevation caused severe sunburn and painful snow blindness, adding to their suffering. As the days stretched into weeks, the psychological pressure became almost unbearable. These young men, most of whom had never faced serious hardship in their lives, had to confront their own mortality on a daily basis. They watched friends die slowly from their injuries, powerless to help. They saw their own bodies wasting away, and felt their strength ebbing with each passing day. Religious faith became crucial for many of the survivors. They held prayer services in the wreckage, drawing strength from their shared Catholic beliefs. They debated theology and philosophy, trying to find meaning in their suffering and hope for their survival. These discussions would later prove crucial when they faced their most difficult moral decision. Some survivors, led by Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, began talking about the possibility of hiking out to find help. The idea seemed almost suicidal. They were surrounded by peaks over 20,000 feet high, with no climbing equipment, no proper clothing, and no idea which direction might lead to safety. But as their situation grew more desperate, even impossible options began to look attractive. By the end of the first month, the survivors had been reduced to eating strips of leather and any organic material they could find. They were slowly starving to death, and everyone knew it. It was then that Roberto Canessa, the medical student, made a suggestion that would haunt all of them for the rest of their lives, but which would ultimately save them. By the 10th day after the crash, the survivors of Flight 571 were facing the harsh reality that they were slowly dying of starvation. Their food supplies had been exhausted for days, and their bodies were beginning to show the unmistakable signs of severe malnutrition. Faces became gaunt and hollow, ribs protruded through thinning skin, and their movements became sluggish and uncoordinated as their bodies began consuming their own muscle tissue to survive. It was Roberto Canessa, the 19-year-old medical student, who first voiced what several of the survivors had been thinking, but were afraid to say aloud. They were surrounded by the frozen bodies of their friends and teammates, 17 people who had died in the crash or from their injuries in the days that followed. These bodies, preserved by the sub-zero temperatures, represented the only source of protein available to them in their frozen prison. The suggestion was met with horror and revulsion from most of the group. These weren't anonymous corpses. They were friends, teammates, family members. Nando Parrado recoiled at the thought of consuming his mother's body. Others argued that it was morally wrong, a violation of everything their Catholic faith taught them about respect for the dead and the sanctity of the human body. But Canessa pressed his case with the cold logic of medical science. He explained that the human body contains all the nutrients necessary for survival: protein, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Without these nutrients, they would all be dead within days. The choice was brutally simple: eat the flesh of the dead or join them in death. There was no moral middle ground, no compromise position that would save their lives while preserving their consciences. The debate that followed was agonizing and went on for hours. Some survivors argued that they should wait longer, that rescue might still come. Others insisted that eating human flesh was a sin that would damn their souls. A few suggested that they should draw lots to determine who would die to feed the others, but this idea was quickly rejected as murder. Gustavo Zerbino, despite his youth, played a crucial role in the discussion by framing it in religious terms. He argued that God would not condemn them for doing what was necessary to survive, that their friends who had died would want their bodies to serve some purpose rather than being left to rot in the snow. He pointed out that Catholics believe in the resurrection of the soul, not the body, and that consuming the flesh of the dead was therefore not a violation of their religious beliefs. The turning point came when several of the survivors made a pact with each other. They agreed that if they died, They would want their bodies to be used to keep their friends alive. This mutual consent helped to ease some of the moral burden of what they were about to do, transforming it from desecration of the dead into a final act of friendship and sacrifice. The first person to actually take a piece of human flesh and eat it was Roberto Canessa himself. Using a piece of broken glass from the aircraft, he cut a small strip of meat from one of the bodies and forced himself to chew and swallow it. The taste was reportedly not as bad as they had expected, similar to beef but slightly sweeter. More importantly, it provided desperately needed protein and energy. One by one, most of the other survivors followed Canessa's example. Some could not bring themselves to participate and survived on tiny portions shared by others. But the majority recognized that eating the flesh of the dead was their only hope for survival. They established rules about the process. They would not eat the bodies of close relatives. They would say prayers before each meal, and they would treat the dead with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. The psychological impact of crossing this ultimate taboo was devastating for all involved. Many of the survivors vomited the first few times they tried to eat human flesh, as much from psychological revulsion as from any physical reaction. They developed elaborate mental strategies to cope with what they were doing. Some imagined they were eating something else. Others focused on the necessity of survival, and many turned to prayer for forgiveness and strength. Despite the availability of this grim sustenance, life in the fuselage remained a daily struggle for survival. The constant cold, the thin air, and the psychological stress of their situation continued to take a terrible toll. Several more survivors died from their injuries or from the effects of exposure, adding to the supply of preserved bodies, but also reducing the number of people who needed to be fed. The survivors developed a system for preparing and distributing the flesh that helped to maintain some semblance of civilization in their desperate circumstances. They appointed specific people to cut the meat, established fair distribution methods, and maintained strict rules about cleanliness and food safety. These routines helped to preserve their sanity and their social bonds during the darkest period of their ordeal. What do you think about this impossible moral dilemma? Could you make the same choice if your life depended on it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because the survivors' ordeal was far from over, and they would face even greater challenges in the weeks ahead. The decision to eat human flesh saved their lives in the short term, but it also created new psychological burdens that would haunt the survivors long after their rescue. They had crossed a line that separated them forever from the normal world, and they knew that if they were ever rescued, they would have to live with the knowledge of what they had done to survive. Yet without this terrible choice, none of them would have lived to tell their story. As October turned into November, the survivors of Flight 571 had established a grim routine of survival high in the Andes. The consumption of human flesh had provided them with the protein and energy needed to stay alive, but their situation remained desperate. They were still trapped at 14,000 feet, surrounded by impassable peaks, with no contact with the outside world, except for the occasional radio transmission that confirmed the search for them had been abandoned. The psychological toll of their circumstances was becoming more evident each day. Several survivors showed signs of severe depression, spending most of their time lying motionless in the fuselage, speaking only when necessary. Others became obsessively focused on small tasks, organizing their meager possessions, cleaning the aircraft interior, or maintaining the radio equipment, as a way of maintaining some sense of purpose and control. Nando Parrado had emerged from his 3-day coma to discover that his mother was dead and his sister Susanna was dying. The devastation of losing his family, combined with the horror of their survival situation, transformed him from a carefree young man into someone driven by an almost superhuman determination to escape the mountains. He began to speak constantly about hiking out to find help, studying the surrounding peaks and planning potential routes to civilization. Roberto Canessa shared Parrado's determination to attempt an escape, but his medical training made him more realistic about the challenges they would face. He knew that hiking across the Andes at high altitude, without proper equipment or adequate food, would be extremely dangerous, but he also understood that staying in the fuselage indefinitely was not a viable option. They were slowly dying despite the availability of human flesh for food, The other survivors were divided about the wisdom of attempting to hike out. Some, led by Roy Harley and Gustavo Zerbino, believed they should continue to wait for rescue while working to improve their shelter and their chances of being spotted by a search aircraft. Others, recognizing that no rescue was coming, supported the idea of sending their strongest members to find help, even though it might mean death for those who attempted the journey. On November 29th, exactly 47 days after the crash, their debate became academic. A massive avalanche triggered by wind and unstable snow conditions crashed down the mountainside and buried the fuselage completely. The survivors, who had been sleeping inside the aircraft, suddenly found themselves trapped in a tomb of snow and ice with no way out and a rapidly diminishing supply of air. The avalanche was perhaps the most terrifying experience of their entire ordeal. In a matter of seconds, their cramped but familiar shelter became a suffocating death trap. Snow poured through every opening, and the survivors were buried under tons of ice and debris. Several people were completely covered and had to be dug out by their companions, who worked frantically in the darkness to prevent them from suffocating. 8 more people died in the avalanche, bringing the total death toll to 25 out of the original 45 passengers. Among the dead were some of the strongest and most optimistic survivors, including Marcelo Perez, the rugby team captain who had been a source of leadership and morale for the group. The loss of so many people in a single moment was devastating to those who remained. The survivors spent 3 days buried under the snow, waiting for it to settle enough that they could dig their way out. During those 3 days, they were forced to remain motionless in complete darkness, breathing stale air and listening to the groans of the settling snow above them. Several times they thought they were going to suffocate, and some began to prepare for death, saying their final prayers and making peace with their situation. When they finally managed to dig their way to the surface, they found their world completely transformed. The avalanche had changed the entire landscape around the crash site, burying landmarks and making it even more difficult to navigate. More importantly, it had destroyed much of their shelter and many of their supplies, leaving the remaining 16 survivors in an even more precarious situation than before. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible tale of human endurance. I know these details are difficult to hear, but they show the extraordinary challenges these young men faced. The most heroic part of their story, the final escape attempt, is still coming, so please don't leave us now. The avalanche marked a turning point in the survivors' psychological state. The death of 8 more people in a single moment, after they had already endured so much, broke the spirit of several survivors who had been holding on to hope. Some became completely withdrawn, refusing to participate in group activities or help with survival tasks. Others became obsessed with death, spending hours staring at the bodies of their friends and talking about joining them. But for Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, the avalanche had the opposite effect. They now understood with absolute clarity that no rescue was coming, and that staying at the crash site meant certain death for everyone. The avalanche had been a warning. Winter was coming, and conditions would only get worse as the months progressed. If they were going to save themselves and their friends, they had to act immediately. The 2 men began serious planning for an expedition across the mountains. They studied the surrounding peaks, trying to identify the most promising route toward Chile. They gathered what equipment they could from the wreckage: a few pieces of warm clothing, some makeshift tools, and supplies of human flesh that would sustain them during the journey. Most importantly, they prepared themselves mentally for what they knew would be a desperate gamble with death. After 61 days trapped in their frozen hell, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa made the decision that would determine whether any of the Flight 571 survivors would ever see their families again. On December 12, 1972, accompanied by Antonio Tintin Vicentin, they set out from the crash site to attempt the impossible: a trek across the Andes Mountains to find help for the 14 friends they were leaving behind. The expedition was planned with meticulous care, despite their limited resources. The 3 men had fashioned crude equipment from materials salvaged from the aircraft wreckage. They wore multiple layers of clothing scavenged from the dead, wrapped their feet in insulation torn from the plane's walls, and carried improvised backpacks made from seat covers. Most importantly, they packed strips of human flesh, their only source of protein for the journey ahead. The route they chose led west toward Chile, based on Parrado's conviction that the green valleys he could see in the distance must contain rivers that flowed toward the Pacific Ocean and civilization. It was a reasonable assumption, but one that would lead them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Andes, across glaciers, over mountain passes, and through areas where the slightest mistake could mean death. The first day of hiking revealed just how difficult their journey would be. At 14,000 feet, every step was an exhausting effort in the thin air. The snow was often deep and unstable, causing them to sink up to their waists with each step. The intense ultraviolet radiation at high altitude caused severe sunburn despite the cold temperatures, and the reflection of light off the snow created a blinding glare that made navigation extremely difficult. By the end of the first day, they had traveled only a few miles and were already exhausted. They spent the night huddled together in a sleeping bag they had fashioned from aircraft materials, trying to stay warm as temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. The psychological pressure was enormous. They knew that if they failed, not only would they die, but their 14 friends back at the crash site would also perish. The second day brought new challenges as they climbed higher into the mountains. The terrain became increasingly steep and dangerous, with hidden crevasses that could swallow a person without warning. Antonio Vicentin, who was the weakest of the three, began to struggle with the pace and the altitude. By evening, it was clear that he could not continue the journey at the speed necessary to reach help in time. The decision to send Vicentin back to the crash site was agonizing but necessary. Every person they sent back reduced their chances of success, but continuing with someone who couldn't keep up would doom all three of them. Vicentin made the lonely journey back to the fuselage, carrying messages from Parrado and Canessa to their friends and the terrible knowledge that the success of the entire group now depended on just 2 men. Parrado and Canessa continued west, now completely on their own in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They were carrying enough food for 10 days, but they knew that if they hadn't found help by then, they would be too weak to continue. Every day was a race against time, against their dwindling strength and against the weather conditions that could trap them in a storm at any moment. The physical challenges of their trek were almost beyond description. They were climbing peaks over 15,000 feet high without proper mountaineering equipment, crossing glaciers with improvised crampons made from aircraft metal, and navigating by dead reckoning through terrain that had no trails or landmarks. Both men were already weakened by their 2 months of starvation and exposure, making their achievement even more remarkable. On the 4th day of their journey, they reached what they thought was the final ridge before the green valleys they had seen from the crash site. But when they climbed to the summit, they discovered that they were still surrounded by mountains stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The valleys they had seen from the fuselage were not the edge of the Andes, but merely small pockets of vegetation in the midst of a vast mountain range. This moment almost broke their resolve completely. They had expected to find civilization within a few days, but now they realized they might need to walk for weeks through increasingly difficult terrain. They were already running low on food and energy, and the psychological impact of seeing more mountains instead of rescue was devastating. For several hours, they seriously considered turning back. But Nando Parrado refused to give up. He had lost his mother and sister in the crash, and he was determined that their deaths would not be in vain. He convinced Canessa that they had come too far to turn back, that their friends were counting on them, and that they had to continue even if it meant death. This decision, to continue despite seemingly impossible odds, would prove to be the crucial moment that saved all of their lives. They pressed on, climbing peak after peak, following rivers downstream toward what they hoped would be populated areas. Their feet were badly frostbitten, their faces were burned and cracked by the sun and wind, and they were surviving on tiny rations that barely kept them conscious. But somehow they kept moving forward, driven by a determination that transcended normal human endurance. On December 20th, after 8 days of hiking, they encountered the first sign of human presence they had seen since leaving the crash site: cattle tracks in a valley bottom. The sight of these simple marks in the mud was overwhelming to 2 men who had been alone in the wilderness for so long. They knew that where there were cattle, there must be people. The next day, December 21st, they spotted a man on horseback on the far side of a river. Sergio Catalan, a Chilean muleteer, initially thought the 2 scarecrow figures waving at him from across the water were bearded wild men or ghosts. But when he realized they were trying to communicate, he threw them a piece of paper and a pencil across the river, allowing them to write a message explaining who they were and what had happened. The message Parrado wrote was simple but profound. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a friend up there who is injured. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come and get us? Please. We can't even walk. Where are we?" Catalan immediately understood the magnitude of what he was hearing. He rode quickly to the nearest town to alert the authorities, and within hours, rescue helicopters were being dispatched to search for the crash site. The two men who had walked out of the Andes had succeeded in their impossible mission. They had found help and set in motion the rescue of their 14 friends who were still trapped in the mountains. The rescue of the remaining 14 survivors from the Andes crash site on December 22 and 23, 1972, marked the end of one of the most extraordinary survival stories in human history. The images of the emaciated young men being lifted from their frozen prison by helicopters shocked the world and raised uncomfortable questions about the lengths to which human beings will go to preserve their lives. The story of the Andes survivors has been told and retold countless times in books, documentaries, and films, but it continues to fascinate people because it forces us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, morality, and survival. The decision to consume human flesh to stay alive challenged conventional ethical boundaries and sparked debates about the difference between survival and murder, between necessity and choice. The 16 survivors returned to Uruguay as heroes, but they also carried psychological scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some, like Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, became successful professionals and public speakers, using their experience to inspire others and to promote values of teamwork, determination, and faith. Others struggled with depression, survivor's guilt, and the trauma of their ordeal for decades after their rescue. The medical aspects of their survival have been studied extensively by researchers interested in human adaptation to extreme conditions. Their ability to survive at high altitude for over 2 months, while consuming a diet consisting primarily of human flesh, provided valuable insights into human physiology and the body's capacity to adapt to severe stress and malnutrition. Perhaps most importantly, the Andes survivors demonstrated the power of human friendship and cooperation in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Despite their desperate circumstances, they maintained social bonds, supported each other emotionally, and made collective decisions that prioritized group survival over individual interests. Their story shows that even in the darkest moments, human beings are capable of extraordinary acts of courage, sacrifice, and love. The ethical questions raised by their story remain relevant today, as we continue to face situations where survival conflicts with conventional morality. In medical emergencies, natural disasters, and military conflicts, people are regularly forced to make decisions that challenge accepted ethical standards. The Andes survivors' experience provides a framework for understanding these dilemmas, and for recognizing that moral judgments must sometimes be tempered by an understanding of extreme circumstances. What do you think about the choices made by the Andes survivors? Could you eat human flesh to save your own life and the lives of your friends? Do you believe their decision was morally justified? Or do you think there are some lines that should never be crossed, regardless of the consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story has generated passionate debates for over 50 years, and we want to hear your perspective on one of the most challenging moral dilemmas in human history. If you found this story as compelling and thought-provoking as we did, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you the most incredible true stories of human survival and endurance, examining the moments when ordinary people are forced to make extraordinary choices. Make sure you watch our next recommended video about the Donner Party, another group of people who faced similar moral dilemmas when trapped by winter weather in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's another story that will challenge your understanding of human nature and the price of survival. Thank you for joining us for this remarkable journey into one of the most famous survival stories ever told. The experience of the Andes survivors reminds us that the human spirit is capable of enduring almost anything when sustained by friendship, faith, and an unbreakable determination to live. Their story is ultimately not about the terrible choices they were forced to make, but about the triumph of hope over despair and life over death in the most impossible circumstances imaginable.